59 minutes. That was the number on the old stopwatch in his hand, the cracked plastic kind that loops around your neck on a lanyard, and I watched his thumb press the crown down with no more drama than a man checking the time before church. I was crouched in the cold reeds, maybe 40 yards off, close enough to hear the bog breathing. You know that smell of standing black water before sunrise, peat and rot, and something metallic, like a coin, held under your tongue. My boots had already gone numb. My breath was coming out in little gray ribbons, and in front of me, on the one dry hump of ground in 1,000 acres of marsh, 6 men stood blinking into the dark, while one quiet man told them how the morning was going to go. I'm going to tell you about Maksym, but I want to be straight with you first. I'm nobody. I drove a supply truck out to the lease that week, hauling feed and fence posts, and I stayed because the warden told me to keep my mouth shut, and I have never in my life been worse at following an order. So you're getting this from the cheap seats. The man at the center of it, I never fully understood him. I only saw how he moved. And I have never seen anybody move like that. Here's what I knew that morning, and only that. 6 men had done a terrible thing to a boy who couldn't even hear them coming. The people who were supposed to answer for it had looked the other way and counted their favors. And the forester who was raising that boy had decided that the marsh, the same drowned forest those men had been quietly butchering for sport, was going to settle the account in its own language. He gave them a head start. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it. He didn't ambush them in their sleep. He woke them up, took their rifles, told them the property was closed as of that minute, and handed them 60 seconds short of an hour to run for the road through ground they thought they owned. A sporting head start. His words. He said it the way you'd offer a man a cup of coffee. One of them laughed. 6 against 1, out here. What's an old woodsman going to do? I watched that laugh die in the man's throat over the next 4 hours, and I will carry the sound of it dying for the rest of my life. The stopwatch ticked. The first gray was just touching the water. If you want to know what happens when men who've never once been told no walk into a place where their money means nothing, stay with me and tap that subscribe button, because this story needs telling. 59 minutes. The clock was already running. To make any of it make sense, I have to back up about a week, to the first time I ever laid eyes on the man. I'd been hauling feed out to that marsh lease for a small outfitter for maybe a month. You learn a place by its smells before you learn its name, and that place smelled of wet alder, diesel, and the strange sweetness of peat that's been turning under black water since before anybody alive was born. 1,000 acres of it, slow channels, reed islands, fog that sat on the ground like it owned a deed. The lease belonged to him, Maksym. He'd inherited it from his father, an old marsh man who'd run the place his whole life and died in it the way those men tend to. The first afternoon, I pulled the truck up to the cabin, and there he was on the porch, stripping the action of a shotgun down to parts on a folded towel, not even looking up, tall, quiet in a way that wasn't shy. Hands that had clearly done a lot of careful work, and a little bit of terrible work. I learned later he'd done 12 years in long-range reconnaissance, the kind of soldier they drop a long way from anybody and tell to watch and not be seen. 2 tours, somewhere hot and far. He never bragged about it. He mentioned it once, flat, like a man telling you what road he grew up on. But I'm getting ahead. What stopped me that first day wasn't the soldier. It was the kid. There was a boy on the cabin steps, maybe 10 years old, barefoot, with his palms pressed flat to the wood planks, just pressing, eyes closed. I figured he was simple. Then Maksym tapped the porch rail twice with his knuckle, and the boy's eyes flew open, and his hands shaped quick little signs in the air, and the man signed back, and they both went still and looked off toward the tree line. 20 seconds later, a doe stepped out of the alders 300 yards off, where neither of them could have heard a thing. The boy had felt it, through the ground, through his hands. "He's deaf," Maksym said, the first words he ever spoke to me. "Don't shout. It just confuses people. He reads the water better than I do." That was Timon. I didn't get his story that first day. I got it in pieces, the way you get everything out there. over coffee that tasted like the bottom of the pot, over fence posts and silences. And every piece of it made the thing that happened later harder to stand. Because here's what I didn't know yet. Watching that quiet man and that quiet boy share a look about a deer. In a few days, men with money and friends in all the right offices were going to decide the boy had seen something he wasn't supposed to. And what they did about it. That's where the Marsh stopped being a place to breathe and started being a place to settle a debt. The boy's story came to me over 2 evenings, mostly through the man's hands. Timon wasn't his by blood. 2 winters back, Maksym had been running a trap line for nuisance mink along the far channels when he found smoke coming off an old trapper's shack nobody had used in years. Inside was a kid, half wild, living on whatever the marsh gave up. His people had drowned in a spring flood the season before, went through thin ice on the access road, the way the marsh takes people who think they know it. The boy had walked out of the cold and just kept living. Alone, in a place that kills grown men who get careless. He couldn't hear, never had, and out there, that should have finished him in a week. It didn't. He doesn't need ears, Maksym told me, watching the kid skip flat stones across a black channel from the porch. He's got the whole bottom of his feet. He reads the water through the ground, a beaver tail slap, a boar coming through the reeds, my truck on the far track. Feels it before I hear it. He tapped his own chest. Took me a year just to keep up with him. So the soldier learned to sign. A man who'd spent 12 years being trained to vanish, to watch from a long way off and never make a sound, sat at a kitchen table with a deaf orphan and learned a whole new way of talking with his hands. They'd built something. You could see it in small things. The boy bringing him a heron feather like it was treasure. The man cutting the boy's food into the order Timon liked it without being asked. There was paperwork in the works to make it official. State approval. A woman from the county came out twice with forms. The kid had a future taking shape out there in the reeds, and it was a good one. What I want you to hold on to is this. That boy had a gift most people would call useless. He read the marsh through his skin. And in a few days, that gift was going to put him in the worst possible spot at the worst possible hour. Because the one thing he could do better than anyone was notice. I caught it myself near the end of that week without understanding it. Timon came back from the North Reach one evening moving wrong, tight. He kept signing the same thing to Maksym, fast, sharp little shapes, and then making a square with his fingers, like a box. Like a cage. The man frowned, signed something back, settled him with a hand on the shoulder. I asked what the kid was saying. Maksym looked at me a second too long. Says there's men up on the North Flats. Lights. Cages. He shook his head almost to himself. Probably bait piles for hogs. I'll walk it tomorrow. I have watched him replay that one shrug 100 times since. Tomorrow was already too late. He walked the North Reach the next morning, and I rode along to drop a load of posts. That's how I ended up seeing what the kid had been trying to tell us. We came over a low rise of birch, and the smell hit first. Not the clean rot of the marsh, something else. Gut and blood gone sour in the cold. A heavy, wrong smell. Maksym put a hand flat in the air without looking back, and I stopped like I'd walked into glass. Down in the clearing was a stag. A big one, a real old monarch of an animal. They'd taken the head and the antlers and left the whole rest of him lying there in the frost, untouched, wasting. No meat man does that. Only a man buying a wall trophy does that, and it wasn't one carcass. The man crouched, read the ground the way some people read a page. Tire ruts cut deep where a heavy rig had reversed up to the kill. A flattened lane through the reeds, then a square of trampled mud with steel feed troughs, and a low platform built of fresh-cut planks. A shooting stand, set up so a shooter could sit comfortable, 20 steps off, and put down whatever they turned loose at the bait. Bait piles for hogs, he said quietly, repeating his own words from the night before, and I heard him hate them. He picked something out of the churned dirt. A plastic ear tag, a numbered livestock tag, the kind that goes in a farmed animal's ear. He turned it over in his fingers. They're trucking animals in, penned stock, tame things that walk right up to a man because they've never had a reason not to. Then somebody with a fat checkbook pays to shoot them at arm's length and calls it a hunt. I didn't fully follow it then. He spelled it out flat as a man reading a charge sheet. A whole quiet business. Truck in trafficked, captive raised game, some of it rare, some of it brought in from a long way off. Turn it loose inside a fenced ground and sell rich out-of-towners the thrill of an easy kill and a trophy to hang. The animals never had a chance. That was the point. That was the product. He stood there a long minute in that ruined clearing on his own land, with his father's marsh stinking of waste around him, and I watched something settle behind his eyes that I didn't have a name for yet. Then I heard the engine, far off, on the access track. Maksym already had me by the sleeve, pulling me down into the alder. A black crew cab rolled slow along the far edge, 2 men up front, glassing the tree line. The man went very still beside me, watching, reading their faces through a little monocular he carried, like other men carry a pocket knife. When he finally lowered it, his voice was almost gentle. That was the part that scared me. "I know them," he said. "Everybody around here knows them, and that's exactly why nobody's ever stopped them." That night, back at the cabin, he laid the names out for me over the burnt coffee, and I started to understand why a thing this ugly had gone on so long without a single soul lifting a finger. There were 3 families at the top of it, and they'd grown together like roots in a stump. First was Garrett Vane, owned the timber concession that backed onto the lease, owned the gravel pits, owned half the permits anybody in the county needed to do anything. A big, soft-handed man who'd never been told no by a person who outranked him, because around here nobody did. Vane was the money. The black crew cab was his. Second was his brother-in-law, a fellow named Dolan, who happened to be the regional game commissioner. Sit with that a second. The exact official who signs off on what can be hunted, who can move live animals where, who polices the canned hunt trafficking, was married into the family running it. Every permit, every clean piece of paper, every inspection that never quite happened, that was Dolan, signing with one hand and pocketing with the other. And third was the muscle, a guide outfit run by a pair of brothers, Ridge and Cole Tanner, ex-private security types who ran the actual hunts. They escorted the out-of-region clients in, handled the cages, set the platforms, and made very sure nobody wandered onto the wrong ground. Hard men, good in the woods, used to people doing what they were told. "So the man who'd take a report," I said slowly, "is the brother-in-law of the man who owns the crime, and the men who'd enforce it work for both of them. Now you've got it." Maksym turned the numbered ear tag over in his fingers one more time, then set it on the table between us like a card he was choosing not to play yet. "You can't go around them. There's no around. The road to the law runs straight through their kitchen." I asked him the obvious thing. "Then what do you do?" He didn't answer right off. He looked out the dark window toward the reeds, where the boy was already asleep, and something in his jaw had gone quiet and certain in a way I didn't like at all. "Nothing, for now," he said. "I document it. I make it so clean they can't bury it. I do it the right way first, every honest way. And I let them tell me no to my face. A man deserves the chance to do the wrong thing before you decide what he is." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a careful man drawing a careful line. I drove home that night half convinced this would end in folders and photographs and some slow, grinding fight on paper. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that the clock had already started running, and not the one he'd choose. The next morning, Timon went out at first light to check the wood duck boxes on the far channels, the way he did every day, his bare feet reading the cold ground. And this time, up on those north flats, the men were already there, and they saw him watching. I wasn't there for what happened on the north flats. Nobody was, except them and the boy. What I'm telling you now, the man pieced together later from the ground, the way he read everything, the prints, the drag marks, the cold itself. I'll keep it plain. Some of it doesn't need saying twice. That morning, Dolan, The commissioner was up there in person. So were the Tanner brothers, and a paying client flown in for the weekend. They'd turned a young animal loose at the bait, something rare and frightened, raised in a pen that just stood there blinking, and the client was lining up the easy shot when the boy came over the rise to check his duck boxes. Timon didn't know to be quiet. He couldn't hear his own footsteps. He just stood there in plain sight, 10 years old, barefoot, watching grown men sell the killing of a tame creature for sport. And they saw him see it. A boy who can't hear is, to a certain kind of man, a problem with an easy answer. He can't testify, they figured. He won't even talk. But he'd watched, and the commissioner had a face that could be recognized, and these were men who'd never once paid a price for anything. So they decided to make sure. They caught him at the reed edge. I won't walk you through every minute of it. What I will tell you is they hurt his hands. On purpose. The hands that read the whole marsh through the ground. The hands that signed to the only family he had left. They broke them, deliberate and slow, so a wild, deaf orphan would learn to keep away and keep quiet. And then they left him. That's the part that turns my stomach to this day. They didn't even bother finishing it themselves. They walked him out into the cold, standing water of a back channel. Dropped him in the reeds where the bottom drops away, and left him there, in the dark coming on, soaked through, hands ruined, in water cold enough to stop a grown man's heart by morning. Let the marsh do it. Let it look like a boy who wandered and slipped, an accident, the kind of thing that happens to feral children who live where they shouldn't. They got in the black crew cab and drove out, and the commissioner texted somebody that the trespass problem was handled. The boy didn't drown, though. That's the thing about a child who learned to live in that bog with nothing. He knew which way the ground rose. With 2 broken hands, he couldn't grip a single reed, so he didn't crawl with his hands. He crawled on his elbows and his chin, inch by freezing inch, toward the one hummock of dry peat he could feel tilting up under his belly. And he got his face out of the water, and he held there, shaking, all night, waiting for the one person he believed would come. And at first light, when the man found the cabin empty and the boy's boots still by the door, he started walking. He didn't call out, he just read the ground. And 40 yards into the reeds, pressed into the frost on a flat stone, he found one small handprint, swollen and wrong. He went very still. I got there in the middle of it, and I'll never forget the sight as long as I live. I'd come out early with a load of fence wire and found the cabin door standing open, the truck cold, no smoke from the chimney. Then I saw the man, far out in the reeds, moving in this low, fast crouch, reading the ground, casting left and right like a hound. He wasn't calling the boy's name. Of course he wasn't. The kid couldn't hear it. He was tracking him by the marks his small body had left in the mud and frost, following a trail only that soldier's eyes could hold. I ran after him as best I could, sinking to my knees in the soft places. He found Timon in a back channel, in the cold black water at the edge of a reed bed. The boy had pulled himself half up onto a low hump of peat, chin and chest out of the water, the rest of him still in it, blue around the mouth, eyes open, fixed, terrified. And then, when he felt the man's boots vibrate through the ground, something in his face just broke open with relief. His hands were the part I couldn't look at, swollen, dark, bent in ways hands don't bend. The clever hands that had read the deer through the porch boards, that had shaped quick little words in the air. Ruined. Maksym didn't make a sound. He went into that freezing water up to his chest without a flicker, peeled off his own coat, wrapped the boy in it, and lifted him out against his own body, careful as a man can be, keeping those broken hands from touching anything. He pressed his cheek to the kid's wet hair and held it there a second, and his lips moved, though I never heard what he said. We got him to the truck. The man drove that rough track like the devil was on it, one arm holding the boy to his chest, and I called ahead to the little rural clinic out on the county road. The doctor there was a tired, decent woman who'd seen a lot. She took one look at the boy's hands and stopped being calm. She cut the wet clothes off him, ran warm fluids, packed warmed blankets around that small, shaking body, and worked over him a long time, while I stood useless in the hall, and Maksym stood in the doorway, dripping marsh water onto the linoleum, not moving, not blinking. When she finally came out, she pulled the door shut soft behind her. She was pale. She looked at the man, and she chose her words like they cost her something. "The cold he'll come back from," she said. "Children are tough that way. But his hands," she swallowed. "Those breaks weren't a fall, weren't an animal. Somebody held him and did that. Slow, on purpose." She looked Maksym dead in the eye. Whoever it was meant for it to show, meant it as a message. I watched the man take that in. He didn't shout, he just went still. That deep, settled stillness I'd seen once before, out in the ruined clearing, and very quietly he asked her one thing. "Can he still be moved tonight?" "Because I need to be somewhere first thing in the morning." They kept the boy at the clinic through the night, and the man wouldn't leave the room. So I stayed too, out in the hall on a hard plastic chair, drinking machine coffee that tasted like pennies, watching him through the little window in the door. He sat by that narrow bed for hours, without moving. The boy slept, finally, warmed through, both hands wrapped and splinted, and resting on a pillow like two broken birds. And the forester just watched him breathe. Once in a while he'd lean in close and shape something slow with his fingers near the boy's face, even though the kid's eyes were shut and couldn't read it. I asked him, somewhere around 3 in the morning, what he was signing. He didn't look up. "A promise," he said. "Doesn't matter that he can't see it yet. I'll say it again when he can. Here's the thing I want you to understand about him, because it's the whole story. He wasn't sitting there shaking with rage. I kept waiting for the rage. It never showed. What came over him instead was the opposite, a kind of terrible, level calm, the way a frozen pond goes glassy and still. He told me later, much later, that he knew that feeling from a long time ago, from the far side of the world, in the minutes before a thing started. No fear, no heat, just the arithmetic. Distances, angles, who's where, what the ground will do. A man who spent 12 years learning to be a shadow somebody else aimed had spent 2 years out here trying to put the weapon down for good. And in one cold night, in one small room that smelled of antiseptic and wet wool, I watched him pick it back up, quietly, the way you'd pick up a tool you knew you'd never wanted to need again. But he surprised me, because the first thing he decided to do wasn't the Marsh. "I'm going to the law," he said, around dawn. "First, properly." He laid it out flat. He had the photos from the ruined clearing, the numbered ear tag, the tire ruts, now the doctor's words about the boy's hands. He'd take all of it to the county people whose whole job was to stop exactly this. "A man's owed the chance to choose right," he said. "Even men I already know the answer from. I'll give them the door. I'll let them shut it in my face themselves." I thought that was the careful, decent road. I thought maybe it would work. You hear about a hurt child. Surely somebody official sits up. I didn't yet understand who sat behind those desks. I'd forgotten what he'd told me over the burnt coffee, that the road to the law ran straight through their kitchen, that the official who took reports of canned hunt trafficking was married into the family that ran it. He gassed up the truck at first light and drove into town with a folder on the seat beside him, leaving me to sit with the sleeping boy. He came back 4 hours later, a changed man, and whatever they'd said to him in that office, it had closed the last door he was ever going to knock on politely. He told me about the office that evening, sitting on the cabin steps with his elbows on his knees, in that flat voice that scared me more than shouting ever could. He'd gone first to the county wildlife office, the folder under his arm, the photos of the wasted stag, the numbered ear tag, the platform, the doctor's written note about the boy's hands. He laid it all out on the counter and asked for the commissioner, and after a while they showed him in to Dolan himself. The man behind the desk barely looked at the photographs. He had a soft, easy way about him, Maksym said, the manner of someone who's never once had to hurry. He listened, he nodded, And then he turned the whole thing inside out so smoothly it was almost beautiful to watch. He told me the lease boundaries were in dispute, Maksym said. Said his office had concerns my late father's paperwork was never properly filed. Said a feral, unsupervised, deaf child had clearly wandered into rough country and gotten hurt the way such children do, and that an unstable veteran with combat in his file making wild accusations against respected men. Well, that was the kind of thing that made people worry whether such a man should have custody of a boy at all. I felt the cold come up my own spine. Then Dolan got to the offer. Sign the lease over to the timber concession, Vane's company, the brother-in-law's company, for a fair price. Walk away clean, and the boy's pending guardianship paperwork would sail right through, all signed, no questions. Make trouble, file anything, say one word to anyone, and that same paperwork would find problems. The child would be pulled into state care, placed far away. With his hands the way they are now, his history, his condition, who'd really fight to keep him with a known troublemaker? He smiled when he said it, Maksym told me, folded his soft hands on the desk, and smiled. He thought he was being generous, the forester said. He picked a splinter of wood off the step and turned it in his fingers, the way he'd turned that ear tag. He genuinely believed I'd take it. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not that he's cruel, that he was so sure. He's never met anyone the rules didn't bend for. He looked at me and saw one more man who'd do the math and fold. The Tanner brothers had been there too, he added, leaning in the doorway behind him the whole time, arms crossed, grinning, just so he'd understand the picture. The muscle, the money, and the paperwork. All three in one room, all three telling him the same thing. He'd walked out without raising his voice, got in the truck, drove back, and somewhere on that road, he said, the last of it went quiet in him. The part that still believed a folder of evidence and a hurt child meant something to the people who carried badges out here. He looked up at me then, and the calm in his face was complete. There's no door left to knock on, he said, so I stopped knocking. They only understand one language, the one they used on a 10-year-old, so that's the one I'll answer in, on my ground, by my rules. And the next morning, he started laying them out across the marsh. I half expected him to make calls. He had men in his past, I knew that much. The kind of soldier like him could ring at midnight, who'd come without asking why. I figured that's what this would become, a crew rolling in. He never picked up the phone. This is my ground, he said, when I asked. My father's ground, my boy. I don't bring other men's hands to it. What I owe these people, I pay myself. And that was the end of that conversation. So the next morning I came out with feed and found him down in the old equipment shed, and what he was doing there put a strange, cold feeling in my chest. There was no rack of guns. I half expected that too, and it's the thing people always get wrong about him. He pulled his father's long gun down off the wall, looked at it a long moment, and hung it right back up. If I do this with a rifle, he said, I'm just a different kind of 'em. Worse, maybe. A man with a wall full of dead things. He shook his head. No, the Marsh did the work on that boy when they left him in the cold. The Marsh can do the work on them. What he laid out on the workbench instead were his father's old things. Coils of waxed snare wire, gone dark with age. Heavy spring traps, the leg-hold kind the old man had used on nuisance animals decades back, before any of it was frowned on. A canvas roll of stakes and toggles, a skinning knife, waders patched at the knee, and maps. That was the part that took my breath. He'd unrolled his father's hand-drawn survey of the whole lease across the bench and weighted the corners with shotgun shells, and beside it he'd pinned up the boys' stuff, Timon's own scrawled little trail pictures, the ones the kid drew to show where the channels ran true and where the bottom dropped out from under you. 1,000 acres, and that man knew every false floor in it, every sinkhole that looked like solid moss, every channel that ran chest-deep under a skin of duckweed. Every dry corridor a frightened man would naturally run down because it looked like the only way out. He moved across that map with a grease pencil, slow and certain, marking. Here, a leg hold under the leaf litter on the one firm trail off the high ground. Here, a tangle of snare wire strung low across a gap in the alders. Here, a wide black pool with no bottom that a man in the dark would walk straight into because every other step around it was worse. They take animals that were raised tame, he said, not looking up, turn them loose on ground they've never seen, and call it sport. Fine, we'll see how sporting it is when it's the other way around. He circled one stretch of deep peat near the old duck blinds and tapped it twice with the pencil. This is where it ends, he said. I just have to get them to run into it, and I have to do it on a morning when they're all in one place. Then he straightened up, and something in his face sharpened. Which means I need to know exactly when they're coming back. For the next 2 days he watched. That's the part nobody pictures when they imagine a man like that going to war. No fury, just watching, the way he must have watched from a ridgeline 1,000 miles away. Only now the ground was his own back acreage. He had a little spotting setup he kept in a cabinet, a compact scope and a worn pair of glasses. And before light he'd be out on a reed island a long way off, lying flat in the wet, glassing the north flats and the old gravel road that fed them. I brought him coffee in a thermos and learned to lie down beside him and keep my mouth shut. He read their pattern the way the boy read the water. The Tanner brothers ran the place loose, overconfident, careless. They came and went on the same gravel track every time. They kept the trafficked animals, the penned creatures trucked in for the canned hunt trade, in a long steel barn off the access road, and they never bothered varying their hours, because who out here would dare watch them? That's the gift they gave me, he murmured, the second morning, the scope to his eye. They've never been hunted. They don't know what it feels like to be the thing in the crosshairs, so they leave a trail a child could follow. Back at the cabin, the planning got precise. He walked me through it on the map, low and even, like a man laying out a job. The corridors of dry ground, he'd already set his father's old leg holds, and the snare wire along the only firm lines off the high residence ground, the routes a panicking man would naturally choose. But he left 2 lanes clean, 2 safe paths only he and the boy would ever know, marked by nothing more than a particular split alder, a particular leaning fence post. Everything else funneled toward that bottomless stretch of peat by the duck blinds. He laid out his gear in rows on the bench, the patched waders, night optics he'd kept from the old days, the kind that turned black water into a green pour of light, a spool of paracord, bolt cutters, a heavy flashlight he had no intention of using on himself, and the stopwatch on its cracked lanyard. He set that one apart from the rest, off to the side, and I didn't understand yet why a man hunting in the dark would need to count seconds. Here's the shape of it, he said, tapping the map. I don't ambush them sleeping. That makes me a murderer in the dark, and I won't do that to my father's ground, or to that boy. I give them a head start. I make them run the marsh the way they made tame animals run for paying men. Their own snares, their own ground, their own rules turned around, and the bog decides who reaches the road. He rolled the map up slow and snapped a rubber band around it. I just need them all out here at once, all 6, the money, the badge, and the muscle, in one place, on one morning. He looked at me then, and for the first time there was the faintest edge of something almost like a smile, and I think I know exactly how to bring them running. The way he brought them running was the same channel they'd used to hurt him, their own pride. He let it be known he was folding. Word travels strange in a place like that, through bar stools and gas station counters and the back doors of feed stores. So he made sure the right ears heard the right things, that the forester had buckled after his visit to the commissioner, that he'd packed the boy off to relatives somewhere far, given up, that he was getting his papers in order to sign the lease over to the timber outfit and clear out before winter. A beaten man, doing exactly what beaten men do. It was the only lie they'd swallow whole, because it was the only ending they'd ever seen. People always folded. Why would this one be different? I watched it work. The black crew cab started rolling the access road in daylight again, unbothered. And then came the thing he'd gambled on, the scheduling. The Tanner brothers got greedy. With the troublesome leaseholder supposedly gone soft and gone away, they booked one more big weekend before the cold shut things down. Clients flying in. A real event up at the renovated residence on the high ground. The old gravel pit lodge Vane had fixed up with a generator and a wall and cameras at the gate. He learned all this from the doctor, of all people. She'd kept treating Timon, and she heard things in that clinic. A guide's wife came in, talked too much in the waiting room about the fancy hunt her husband was running Saturday, the live cages already trucked in. The doctor called him that evening, quiet and careful, and told him. She'd guessed by then what kind of man she was dealing with. She didn't ask questions either, so now he had it. A morning when all of them would be in one place, the money, the badge, and the two who'd held a child down. Saturday, first light. He spent the last 2 days seeding the ground. I helped him with the parts that didn't need his hands, hauling the patched waders and the spools of wire out to the staging spots on the reed islands. He rewalked every set himself in the dark, on his knees in the cold muck, feeling each trigger plate, each loop of his father's snare wire, testing the give of the false floors near the duck blinds. He moved a leaning fence post 6 inches so it lined up cleaner with one of the 2 safe lanes. He buried a flashlight and a coil of cord at a hide near the deep peat. By Friday dusk, the whole 1,000 acres was a quiet machine, waiting on one switch. We were on the cabin porch when the first headlights came up the gravel road in the failing light. Then a second set, then a low diesel growl, a heavy truck, the kind that hauls cages. He stood up slow and watched them roll in to take possession of a place they thought was theirs now, never once feeling the trap close around them as they passed it. He checked the stopwatch on its lanyard, hung it around his neck, and looked at me. "They're here," he said, "all of them. Tomorrow, before the sun's up, I give them the head start they never gave anything in their lives." I asked him to let me come. He said no at first. Then he looked at me a long moment and said I could carry the cameras, hang back, and do exactly what I was told. So that's how I came to be lying in the cold reeds on the far side of the lodge ground, the night before all of it, with a video camera and a dry bag against my chest and my heart going like a trapped bird. We crept in close after dark and lay up where I started this whole story for you, 40 yards off the high ground, in the wet, watching the lights burn in the renovated lodge. They had no idea. That's the thing I keep circling back to. They felt safe behind their concrete wall and their generator hum and their cameras pointed at the gate, never once thinking the danger would come from the Blackwater side, from the marsh itself. Men were laughing in there, glasses clinking, a fire going, the good cheer of people who have never in their lives paid for anything. He counted them for me in a whisper, the scope to his eye, naming them off like a list he'd memorized. The 2 guides, the Tanner brothers, Ridge and Cole, moving around the yard, comfortable, armed. The commissioner, Dolan, the soft-handed man from the office, Vane, the timber money, fat and pleased by the fire, and 2 more, the paying clients, flown in for the weekend, men with expensive jackets and the loud, careless voices of people who'd bought their way to the front of every line they'd ever stood in. 6, and then I saw the cages. Down by the barn, in the spill of a work light, sat 2 heavy steel crates on a flatbed. Something paced inside one of them, restless, a long, low shape. I learned later it was a young marsh cat, a lynx, trafficked in from a long way off. The other held a wolf, penned creatures, hauled here in the dark, meant to be turned loose at the bait pile at first light so 2 rich strangers could shoot them at 20 steps and call themselves hunters. The forester went very still beside me when he saw them. I heard his breath go slow and deliberate, the way a man breathes when he's deciding not to do something fast. "That's the product," he murmured. "That's the whole sick heart of it, right there on a trailer. Animals that trust people, brought here to be murdered for a wall." He lowered the scope. "Not tomorrow, they're not." We lay there in the wet most of the night, the cold coming up through the moss into our bones. the lights slowly going out, one window at a time as they drank themselves into bed, certain as kings. An hour before first light, he touched my shoulder. He'd disabled the trucks already, hours ago, slipping in and out of that yard like he'd never been gone. Pulled wires, taken keys, killed the radios. Now he checked the stopwatch one last time. "I'm going in to wake them up," he whispered, "and then I'm going to offer them something none of them deserves. Stay down. Run the camera. Whatever you see, don't make a sound." Then he was gone into the dark, and I lost him completely. The first I knew it had started was the dogs going quiet. There'd been 2 chained at the back of the lodge, and then there weren't. No bark, no whine, just a soft scuffle, and then nothing. He'd handled them gentle, I found out later. Tied them off where they'd be safe, never hurt them. Then the lodge door banged open, and the lights came up, and I heard a man's voice raised, then another, confused, and then afraid. When I crawled close enough to see, the 6 of them were out in the gravel yard in the gray almost light, in their underclothes and unlaced boots, blinking and furious. And there stood the forester at the edge of the spill of the work light, calm as a fence post, a long flashlight in one hand and that stopwatch on its cord against his chest. He'd already done the quiet work. Their trucks sat dead. He'd gathered every weapon in the place. The strong room had been left open, careless, the way men leave things when they fear nothing. And he'd dumped the whole armful of fine rifles into the black channel behind the barn. I heard one of the clients shrieking about it. Then he did the thing none of them expected. He walked over to the flatbed and threw the bolts on both cages. The wolf was gone into the reeds like smoke. The young marsh cat hesitated, then poured out low and vanished. He set the trafficked animals loose into the dark they'd never have seen alive, and he watched them go before he turned back to the men. "This land is closed," he said. It carried the way a quiet voice does when everyone's holding their breath. "As of right now, you've got no trucks, no radios, no guns, and no friends out here. The nearest road that'll take you anywhere is the gravel track, 4 miles, through the marsh." Vane started bellowing about who he was, what he'd do. One of the Tanner brothers took a step, hand going to where a holster wasn't. The forester let it run a second, then cut through all of it. "Here's what I'm giving you," he said. "More than you gave a 10-year-old who couldn't even hear you coming. You get a head start. 1 hour. Run for the road, any way you like, and at first light I come after you. 1 man, no rifle. Reach the gravel, and you're free. I won't touch you. You have my word. And out here, that's worth more than yours ever was." Somebody laughed. I think it was the commissioner. 6 of them, hard men among them, against one woodsman with a flashlight. Of course they laughed. I watched that laugh travel around the yard, ugly and relieved, men telling themselves this was nothing. "An hour," Cole Tanner sneered. "You'll be the one in the bog, old man." The forester didn't argue. He just lifted the stopwatch off his chest, looked down at it, and pressed the crown with his thumb. 59 minutes, he said. "Better start running." And for one long, frozen heartbeat, nobody moved. The frozen heartbeat broke, and they ran. Not together. That was the first mistake, and he'd known they'd make it. Frightened men scatter. The 2 clients bolted straight for the gravel track because it was the only road they understood, the way a city man always runs for pavement. The Tanner brothers split off to flank, trying to go tactical, trying to be hunters again. Vane lumbered after the clients, already wheezing, and Dolan, the commissioner, hung back a beat by the dark barn. I lost him in the shadows, and I didn't think anything of it then. I should have. The forester let them go. That's the thing I'll never forget. He watched the marsh swallow them, and then he just faded the other direction, into the reeds, unhurried. I came to understand he wasn't running them down at all in those first minutes. He was herding. He knew every man's panic would send him down the dry-looking corridors, the firm-seeming lanes, the exact routes he'd seeded days before. He didn't need to catch anyone. The ground would do that. He only had to be a shape in the fog now and then, a footstep where they didn't expect one, a flashlight beam stabbing out from the wrong side, so that every time a man tried to cut toward the road, he'd flinch away and choose the path the Marsh had set for him. I pulled the dry bag tighter and followed at a distance, low, the way he'd told me, the camera running. The clients fell apart first. One of them, a big, soft man in a torn jacket, went down screaming into a sucking pocket of mud up to his thighs, and the more he thrashed, the deeper it took him, and his friend wouldn't go back for him, just kept blundering on alone into the gray. Out across the bog, I could hear it all carrying on the still, cold air, splashing, a man sobbing, someone bellowing Vane's name. The fog held the sound and gave it back twice as loud, and you couldn't tell anymore how many of them there were or where, and I understood then exactly what he'd meant about silence being the cruelest thing. They couldn't see him, they couldn't hear him coming, they could only hear each other falling apart. Cole Tanner, the harder of the two brothers, tried to do it right. I saw him in a band of clearer light, moving low and careful along what looked like the one good trail off the high ground, reading the terrain, picking his line like a professional. He picked the line the forester had left for him. I heard the snap of an old leg-hold spring closing, dull and final under the leaf litter, and then a sound out of that man that I won't try to make into words. He went down hard onto the soft ground. One boot caught fast in his own father's trade, caught in a trap exactly like the ones his kind had used on tame animals for sport, and the cold black water came up around him. And out of the fog, walking, never hurrying, a single dark shape came toward the sound. He didn't finish Cole Tanner. That's worth saying plain, because every cheap version of this story would have him do it. He pinned the man's free arm, sprung the leg hold off his boot, dragged him up out of the cold water, zip-tied his wrists, and lashed him to a fence post on solid ground, where he wouldn't sink and wouldn't freeze. The whole time Tanner was cursing and weeping, and the forester said not one word to him. That was the pattern of the next stretch. Brutal, yes, I won't pretend it was gentle, because it wasn't. Men got hurt in that marsh. A wrenched knee, a snare biting an ankle, a deadfall of stacked timber coming down across a shoulder where a man crashed through where he shouldn't have. The bog and the dark and the cold did most of it, the way he'd promised they would. But no one died out there. He moved through it collecting them like a man checking his trap line at dawn, and that's exactly what it was. His own snares, his own ground, and his own iron rule that not one of them would stop breathing. He took the soft client out of the sucking mud, half drowned and blubbering, and bound him. He ran the second client to ground in a thicket where the man had wedged himself sobbing and given up entirely. He found Vane sitting in 3 inches of black water with his back against a stump, the timber money gone gray and shaking, no fight left in all that bulk. The harder Tanner brother, Ridge, made it the closest to the road. He was good, I'll give him that. He kept his head, found one of the firmer lines, and very nearly reached the gravel. But very nearly is the whole story of that morning. 40 steps from the track, he hit a stretch of false floor, that skin of green moss over nothing, and went through to his chest. By the time the forester reached him, he'd stopped struggling and started bargaining, and a bargaining man is already caught. I followed it all through the lens of that camera, my hand shaking so hard I could barely hold it, and what struck me, what still wakes me at night, was how quiet he stayed. No shouting. He'd appear out of the fog beside a trapped, terrified man, do the work with his hands, secure him, and move on toward the next sound. A reckoning carried out the way another man might bring in firewood. 5. I'd counted 5 of them down and tied when I crawled up beside a tied-off Vane and got my breath. 5. 2 clients, both Tanners, the timber man. And then it hit me cold, the thing I'd half seen and let go at the start. The commissioner, Dolan, the soft-handed man who'd hung back by the dark barn while the others bolted. I'd lost him at the very beginning and never found him again. And neither, I realized with a lurch, had the forester. He was still out there, somewhere in the fog, the one man who'd kept his wits, the one who knew exactly how much trouble he was in and exactly who to call to make it disappear, and he'd had a long head start of his own. I found him by the cages, the empty cages, on the dead flatbed, where it had all started an hour before. The fog had thinned to a gray haze, and the first real light was coming up cold over the reeds. He had 5 of them lined and bound on the firm ground by the barn, shivering, soaked, finished, and he was crouched at the edge of the black channel, reading something in the mud that I couldn't see. "Dolan never ran," he said before I could speak. "He doubled back. Smart man. He went to where I'd be deaf myself." I asked what he meant. He stood, and there was the first crack in that terrible calm. Not fear, but the cold understanding of a man who'd hit a thing he hadn't planned for. "Before I cut the radios," he said. He keyed his, just for a second. I missed it. He nodded toward the lodge, toward the wall and the gate and the dead generator. "He doesn't need a phone. He's the commissioner. He's got men who answer to him sitting in a substation 40 minutes off, and a story already half built. A deranged veteran, an armed standoff, hostages. By full light, he'll have county vehicles rolling up that gravel track, and when they get here, they won't be coming to arrest the people who hurt a child. They'll be coming for me. And once I'm in a cell, that boy goes wherever Dolan says he goes." That landed in my stomach like cold water. 5 men tied in the reeds, and the 6th, the one with the badge, had turned the whole thing inside out from the dark, the same slick way he'd turned it inside out across his desk. Vane, lashed to the post nearby, heard enough of it to start laughing, an ugly, wet sound through his bruises. "He'll bury you," he wheezed. "Both of you. You should have taken the money." The forester crossed to him slow, crouched, and looked at the big man until the laugh dried up. "I'm not going to kill any of you," he said. "I told you that, and I keep my word, even out here, even now. That's the difference between us that you've never once understood." He stood. "But I'm not going to let a man with a badge walk back into town and write the ending." He pulled a stopwatch off his neck, that cracked plastic thing that had run the whole morning, and looked at it, and for the first time, it wasn't counting down their time. It was counting down his. Then his eyes moved past me, to the flatbed, to the empty cages, to the steel barn looming behind them in the new light, and I watched something turn over behind his face, fast and certain. The man finding a different door in a wall everyone else would have called solid. "The proof I need isn't in town," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's been sitting right here the whole time, in those cages, in that barn, in those 2 soft men in their torn jackets who paid to be here." He looked at me, and the calm was back, harder than ever. Dolan started a clock. "Fine. Let's see who gets their story out first." He didn't trust a courthouse to save him. That was the whole logic of what he did next, and it was fast. He went into that steel barn with the bolt cutters and a flashlight, and he had me film every step of it. And what was in there told the real story better than any folder ever could. Rows of holding pens, more cages stacked at the back, 2 of them still holding frightened animals trucked in for the weekend. A wall of paperwork on a clipboard, fake transit manifests, the numbered ear tags by the boxful, shipping labels from a long way off, and a chest freezer that, when he lifted the lid, was packed with trophy heads and hides, the harvest of the canned hunt trade, waiting on the next paying buyer. I got all of it. The pens, the manifests, the freezer, the trembling live animals. Dolan's signature on 3 of the transit forms, the commissioner's own name on the paper that made the whole rotten trade legal looking. The heart of it laid bare in the gray morning light. Then he hauled the 2 clients to their feet, the soft men in torn jackets who'd flown in to kill tame creatures for fun, and walk them through the barn one at a time, the camera running, and made them say into the lens who'd invited them, what they'd paid, and to whom. Terrified, half-frozen, certain the bog still wanted them, they talked. They'd have confessed to anything to be let near a warm car. But footage in a camera sitting on my chest was no good if Dolan's men got here first and took the camera, took us, took the night. He knew that, so he didn't drive toward town and the law at all. "There's one person left in this county worth a damn," he said, loading the 2 clients into the back of the Dead Lodge's only working vehicle, an old utility quad they'd left fueled by the barn. Not a badge, not an office. He met a woman named Sarah Voss. I'd never heard the name. She ran the regional wildlife rescue 2 valleys over, an old field medic he'd known in another life, someone who'd spent years documenting the canned hunt trade and watching Dolan's office bury every complaint she filed. She hated these men with a clean, patient hatred, and she had something none of us had: reach. A network of outposts, contacts, people who'd listen the second she said go. "I get this to Sarah," he said, "and it stops being something a county commissioner can make disappear. It goes wide before he can write his story. The barn, the freezer, the manifests, their own voices. All of it, everywhere, at once." He sat me on the quad with the 2 bound clients and the camera, pointed me at the backtrack that skirted the marsh, and pressed a folded scrap of paper with her number into my hand. "Go," he said. "I'll hold here with the others. If Dolan's men come up the gravel, they come to me, not to you." I was 20 yards down the track, the engine whining, the cold wind in my teeth, when I saw it through the trees ahead. Headlights, already on the access road, coming fast. And they were coming from the wrong direction to be anyone but his. I killed the quad's engine and just sat there in the cold, heart slamming, watching those headlights swell through the trees. 2 sets, then 3. Coming up the gravel from the town side, exactly the direction Dolan's men would come. I shouted back toward the barn. The forester was already moving, already up at the edge of the access road by the time I bounced the quad back up there, the 2 bound clients clinging on behind me. He'd put himself between the road and everything else. 1 man, no rifle, the stopwatch still around his neck, standing on the causeway where the gravel ran out over the marsh, waiting for whatever was coming. The vehicles slewed to a stop 40 feet off. Doors, men climbing out, 3 of them in plain county jackets. And there in the middle of them, fresh and dry and smug, Dolan. He'd reached his people. He'd had time to put on a clean coat and a new face. He stepped to the front of them with his soft hands spread, already talking, already selling it. "That's him," he called to his men, pointing. "Armed, unstable. He's got hostages back there, taking respected citizens at gunpoint, beating them. You saw the bulletins I sent. Take him down, and we sort it after." It was perfect. It was the same trick from his office, scaled up. Make the forester the criminal, make himself the rescuer, and write the Marsh out of history. The county men's hands went to their belts. They didn't know any better. To them, this really was a deranged veteran on a killing spree. The forester just spoke, loud and level, into the cold. "There's no gun on me. Search me. The men back there are tied, not shot. Every one of them breathing, and you can check that too." He didn't look at the county man. He looked straight at Dolan. "What's in that barn behind me is the canned hunt trade your commissioner there has been signing off on for years. Trafficked animals, a freezer of trophies, his name on the manifests, and 6 men's own voices saying so." Dolan's smile didn't move. "He's lying. Take him." And here's the thing the commissioner didn't know. Sarah Voss already had it. The forester had never needed me to reach her by phone. He'd handed her the whole thing the night before when he slipped in and out of the lodge yard, a copy of everything he'd gathered in the days of watching, dropped to her in the dark with a single instruction. "If you don't hear from me by full light, put it all out, everywhere, at once." It was past full light. One of the county men's radios crackled. Then his phone buzzed, then the second man's. Somebody's screen lit up with a regional alert, a wildlife network bulletin, a video already loose and multiplying. The barn, the freezer, the cages, Dolan's signature, the client's own confessions. Too many eyes, too fast, in too many places to ever pull back. The two county men looked down at their phones. Then they looked up at their commissioner, and something in their faces began, very slowly, to change. Dolan saw it too, and the smile finally cracked. That's when one of his men's hands tightened on his weapon, and a small figure stepped out of the reeds onto the causeway. It was the boy. It was Timon. I think my heart stopped. He should have been miles off, safe, healing. But there he was, stepping out of the reeds onto the gravel causeway in the cold morning light, both hands still wrapped and splinted, a woman in a green field jacket right behind him, with a phone held up high and recording. Sarah Voss. She hadn't just put the files out and waited. She'd driven straight to the Marsh, and somewhere along the road she'd picked up the one person who could end this. Because the doctor, who knew everything, had quietly kept him close, and the boy had refused to be anywhere but here. He walked right past the man who was raising him, past the forester's outstretched arm, and he planted himself in front of Dolan and the county men. And he lifted those broken, wrapped hands, and he began to sign. Slow, clumsy, the splints made every shape a struggle. But the woman behind him spoke each one aloud for the camera, steady and clear, so the whole world that was already watching her feed could understand. I was there. I saw the man with lights. I saw the cages. I saw them shoot the tame ones. And then he pointed one bandaged hand straight at Dolan, and the woman's voice didn't waver. That one. He was there. He held me down. The deaf orphan they'd tried to erase in the cold, the witness they'd been so sure could never speak, was naming the commissioner on a live broadcast that thousands of people were already sharing. You could see it break across the county men's faces. They weren't looking at a deranged veteran anymore. They were looking at a hurt child with ruined hands accusing their boss, and a barn full of trafficked animals behind him, and the whole thing pouring out across every screen in the region in real time. Whatever story Dolan had sold them on the drive up died right there on the gravel. The commissioner felt the ground go out from under him. I watched it happen, the soft, sure man who'd never once been told no, who'd smiled across a desk and across a campfire, who'd been so certain everyone folds. His mouth opened. Nothing came. For the first time in his life, he had no one to call, and no story left that anyone would buy. One of his own men turned to look at him, hand drifting off his weapon and toward his cuffs instead. And that, the look on his man's face, the cameras, the boy, the end of everything he'd built, was the moment Dolan stopped being a commissioner and became just a cornered thing. His hand shot under that clean coat, going for the only piece anyone had left out here, lunging not at the forester, not at the county men. He lunged at the boy. The forester was already moving before Dolan's hand cleared the coat. I've turned that half second over and over, and I still can't tell you how a man covers that much ground that fast. One instant he was standing easy by the dead trucks. The next he was between the commissioner and the boy, and it was done. He didn't strike to kill. He never once, that whole long morning, struck to kill. He took the wrist, turned it the wrong way, and the small pistol Dolan had been hiding spun loose and clattered across the gravel into the reeds. A short, hard sweep, and the soft-handed man was face down on the cold causeway, with his arm pinned and the forester's knee in his back, caught the same way he'd held a child down, only now there was no one left to laugh. "You don't touch him," the forester said, quiet, right against the man's ear. "Not your hand, not your voice, not ever again." Then he looked up at the two county men, and he said the thing that ended it. "He's yours now. All of it's yours. Do your job, or don't, but it's all on camera, and it's already everywhere." And they did their job, maybe because the whole region was watching the live feed, maybe because a hurt deaf boy with wrapped hands had just named their boss to the world. Maybe because, deep down, they'd always known what Dolan was, and only needed one safe second to act like it. One of them pulled his cuffs and snapped them onto the commissioner's wrists right there in the mud. The other was already on the radio, calling not for backup to save Dolan, but for state investigators, outside men, clean men, the kind whose hands the county couldn't reach. It came apart fast after that, the way rotten things do once the first bean goes. Down by the barn, the 5 tied men started talking over each other, each one trying to be the first to blame the others. The timber money, the 2 soft clients, the Tanner brothers. Sarah Voss moved among them with her phone, calm as a woman taking inventory, getting every word. The whole house of cards the 3 families had built over years folded in under an hour, on the very ground they'd treated as their private hunting park. I should have felt triumph. I kept waiting for it, the same way I'd kept waiting for the Forresters' rage that first night by the hospital bed. It didn't come. What came, standing on that gravel in the rising light with the cuffs clicking shut, was something heavier and quieter, almost like grief. I looked over at the Forrester. He'd let the county men take Dolan, stepped back, and he was watching the tree line where the marsh swallowed the last of the fog. Something moved out there at the edge of the reeds, low, gray, watching us back. The young marsh cat, the trafficked one he'd cut loose at first light, hadn't run far after all. He stood very still, looking at the freed creature looking at him, and I saw on his face the first real crack of the morning. Not fear of the law, not the cold, something else. The look of a man wondering what he'd had to become to win. The fallout went the way he'd planned it to, which is its own kind of strange to watch. A man bet everything on the system working once you took away the people who jammed it, and the bet paid. Outside investigators came within the day, and they were not gentle. With Sarah Voss's footage everywhere and the live confessions impossible to wave off, there was no quiet hand to make it go away. The timber concession got frozen. The permits Dolan had signed got pulled and poured over. The barn, the freezer, the manifests, the trafficked animals, all of it became evidence in a case far bigger than one bad weekend. The whole canned hunt trade that had been running through that county for years came up into the light, and the 3 families who'd treated the place as their property went down together, one by one, in the months that followed. I gave my statement. I handed over the footage. I told them about the dead trucks, the head start, the snares, all of it. And I'll be honest with you, I worried for the Forrester. He'd taken 6 men out into a bog and run them ragged, hurt them, terrified them. But not one of them died. Not one was struck, except to be subdued. The doctor's note about a child's broken hand sat in the same file as the confessions, and the investigators who read it all together understood exactly what kind of man does that, and still carries everyone out alive. He didn't gloat to me about any of it. That evening back at the cabin, he sat on those same porch steps where he'd first laid out the names, and he was quiet a long time. "I keep waiting to feel like I won," he said finally. "It doesn't come. I felt it in the marsh, too, that old empty quiet from a long way off. You do the thing that has to be done, and then you just stand in the hole where it used to be." I asked him if he regretted it. "No," he said, and he meant it. "But I'm not proud of how easy it was to be that man again. I put him down 2 years ago. He came back in one night, and he came back fast. He looked at his own hands. I just have to make sure he goes back in the box now. For good." What scared him, he told me, wasn't the law. The law was going to land on Dolan and Vane and the rest, hard, and stay there. What scared him was the boy. Timon had seen all of it. The fog, the cuffs, the commissioner face down in the mud, the man who fed him and signed bedtime nonsense to him moving through that morning like something out of a war. And the Forrester sat there afraid, genuinely afraid, the only time I ever saw him so, that the child would look up at him now and see not a father, but a thing to be frightened of. Another man with hard hands. He got up off the steps, and he stood a moment looking at the lit window of the room where the boy was. "I have to go in there," he said, "and I don't know how he's going to look at me." The boy was sitting up in bed when he went in, and I watched from the doorway. Timon looked at the man a long, careful moment. the same gray light study I'd seen the night he found him in the reeds. Then he lifted his wrapped hands and signed one slow word, and the forester's whole body went loose with relief. He'd told me later what the word was. Home. The boy wasn't afraid of him. He'd never been afraid of him. He'd been afraid the marsh might take this man too, the way it had taken everything else he loved. That's where the real mending started, and it wasn't quick, and I won't lie to you and say it was. There were nights the boy woke, shaking from nightmares his hands couldn't even tell. There were days the forester sat on those steps a long time before he could make himself be gentle. But the thing about that pair was that neither of them was alone in it anymore, and that turned out to be most of the cure. And here's the part I never saw coming, the part that made the whole bloody business worth telling. He didn't just go back to running a hunting lease. With Vane's concessions seized and the canned hunt trade torn out by the roots, the ground itself was suddenly free of the men who'd treated it like a private killing floor. So the forester did something nobody expected. He filed papers to turn the whole 1,000 acres into a protected wildlife sanctuary. No more leases, no more shooting platforms, no more cages. The marsh his father had kept and he had bled for would never again be a place where a frightened animal was sold to a stranger for sport. The freed marsh cat became the first resident. It had stayed near the duck blinds all that autumn, and Sarah Voss helped him set up a small rehabilitation pen by the old barn, the same barn that had held the trafficked creatures, now scrubbed out and made over into something clean. The wolf, they tracked and confirmed, had crossed off into wild country and made it. Other animals came after, the broken ones, the orphaned ones, the ones nobody else would fight for. Timon's hands healed crooked. The doctor had been honest about that from the start. The breaks had been too deliberate, too thorough, to ever come back perfect. The clever, quick fingers that once read a deer through the porch boards moved stiffly now. The joints knotted, but they worked. By spring, he was back out on the water, relearning the channels through the soles of his bare feet, reading the marsh the only way he ever had, the way no machine and no warden ever could. I'd come out with feed still, and I'd find them down by the new pens, the man and the boy, working side by side in the cold, clean air, and the place felt nothing like it had that gray dawn. One evening, near the end of that first year, the forester stood looking at the boy, crouched at the water's edge, palms flat to the ground, listening to something only he could feel. And he turned to me and said there was one job left at the sanctuary that he'd been saving for exactly one person. The job he'd been saving was ranger of the sanctuary, its first, and there was only one person he ever meant to give it to. He did it on an ordinary morning, no ceremony, which is how that man did everything that mattered. He'd cut a small badge out of a strip of brass, hammered flat and stamped by hand with a heron in flight, and he pinned it to the collar of Timon's coat down by the water. Then he stepped back and signed, slow enough for the boy to catch every shape. This land belongs to the animals now, and you're the one who watches over it. You hear what nobody else can hear. That makes you the ranger. The boy looked down at the brass on his chest, then up at the man, and his stiff, crooked hands lifted and shaped one word back. He didn't sign thank you. He signed home, the same word from that first night, and I understood, finally, that for him, the two meant the same thing. The investigators carried it all the way through. The commissioner went away for a long stretch and never wore a badge again. The timber money, the muscle, the two who'd flown in to kill tame creatures for a wall, every one of them answered for it, on the strength of their own voices and a hurt boy's testimony. The county got new people who didn't take envelopes, and the marsh that had been a private killing ground for a clique of well-connected men became, of all things, a place where broken animals were brought to mend. Here's the thing I carried away from it, and I'll give it to you the way it came to me, standing at that water's edge. The men who hurt that boy weren't strong. They only ever looked strong because everyone around them had agreed to be afraid. Take the fear away, one quiet morning, one count of 59 minutes, and they were just frightened things floundering in cold water, the way they'd left a child to flounder. Cruelty like theirs is a building with no foundation. It stands exactly as long as nobody pushes. That spring, the duck boxes filled again. A barefoot boy with a brass heron on his coat crouched at the reed line, palms flat to the warming ground, feeling the whole living marsh move through his hands, and the man who'd raised him stood a little way off, watching him be safe. So I'll leave you with the question the forester left me with, the one I still can't answer clean. When the people sworn to guard us are the ones doing the hunting, and every honest door is bolted from the inside, was he wrong to answer in the only language that ground understood? Tell me in the comments where you land on it, and if this story held you, follow along. There are more like it coming.